They're the equivalent of journalistic fishtails, huge stories that we could have gotten first if only we had stuck with it. Usually, we don't hear about the one that got away until now. Turns out the Las Vegas Review-Journal had the Steve Wynn sexual misconduct story decades ago. The Wall Street Journal's recent Steve Wynn expose was a bombshell.
A manicurist says he forced her to have sex in his office suite.
That was one of a bunch of ugly accusations that forced Wynn's exit from the casino empire he built. But it turns out the allegations were documented in court filings that could have surfaced a lot earlier.
The papers were part of a lawsuit against Wynn in the 90s.
That 20-year-old lawsuit was filed by 11 women. At the time, a Las Vegas Review-Journal reporter, Carrie Geer-Teveno, spoke with two of the plaintiffs and wrote a story. But as she told NPR, it never ran.
I was called into a meeting in the publisher's office with several Mirage attorneys. It was after that meeting, as I recall, that our publisher suggested that we polygraph the women. And when the results came back, I was told we were not publishing the story and to delete it from the system.
That history was also laid out in this story in the Review-Journal, which is now owned by Wynn's casino rival, Sheldon Adelson. The Review-Journal's publisher back in the 90s says he doesn't recall anything about the story or why it might have been spiked. Well, we all know why it was spiked, because it was Las Vegas, it was the casino industry, and they couldn't afford to alienate Steve Wynn or anybody else. And, you know, it was common, I mean, I hate to say it, but it happened to a lot of organizations like that. You can't cover the lottery if they're your advertiser.
No, and I mean, it was all based on court records, so there really was very little in the way of any legal liability they had to worry about. You know, it's too bad that the story didn't come out 20 years ago. On the other hand, as we know, these stories have their moments. And if this had come out 20 years ago, I think the impact would have been limited. It would have been a huge brouhaha for a few days, and it would have faded into the woodwork. It never would have ended his career the way it has this time.
And what's troubling about these kinds of stories is that it reinforces some of the criticism that people have against the media, that when we choose to cover stories or don't choose to cover a story, that it's influenced by something, whether it's a business or, you know, some political figures or so forth. And in general, that isn't the case. But I think when you see something like this, you realize that there is that influence, especially in a place like Las Vegas. You have someone who has a lot of money, who potentially pays for a lot of advertising or is connected to someone who does. And people make decisions. And then as for a wrong decision, certainly, and as for not remembering, not recalling, that doesn't ring true to me. I mean, if you are involved in anything that had to do with Steve Wynn, you'd remember it.
It's also interesting to look at this in the context of it was a federal court filing. It's a lawsuit. It's a public document, which means at a certain level we shouldn't just be blaming the Las Vegas Review-Journal. We should be blaming every other media in Nevada because they all passed on this obvious story that was handed to them in court documents. I think that it's actually to the Review-Journal's credit that they went back and revisited this. The Review-Journal was bought by Sheldon Adelson a couple of years ago, who has, in a number of occasions, tried to influence its content and its reporting. And to their credit, the good reporters who work there have fought back against that. And I think that the fact that they are able to stake this out was a good thing. I do agree with Dan, though, that if this had come out 20 years ago, it would have just been, you know, it wouldn't have done anything.
And it may be that the woman who was doing it, who was a young woman then, was so freaked out. You know, I know what you're saying. It's hard to believe that she forgot about it. But remember, in the story, she said she went looking for it when it was triggered by the Wall Street Journal story, and it wasn't online anywhere, and she found it in a box. I think she had enough presence of mind to keep her notes. The reporter, yes, the reporter whose story was first spiked. She kept all the documents. She could have really actually gotten rid of it. Yeah. So
she knew she had the goods.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
And one last point. It's also interesting that the idea to judge this was to have a polygraph test on these people. Oh. Yeah. That sort of pseudoscience would be applied to whether or not you're going to run a story is just absurd.
Yeah. And one of them came back having told the truth, and the other one was a little wishy-washy, and she said she was just very nervous.